Hello, in this video, I want to continue and finish out just this segment of what I've been talking about for the Moten and intellectual property protections video. If this is your first time tuning in, I would definitely go back and at least watch the last video that I did talking a little bit about Moten on the negative versus policy teams, because that's going to frame this continuation of that conversation, which is how do we use Moten and Harney, the undercommons, and the critiques as they forward against policy teams on the intellectual property protections resolution for September and October. I think that a lot of the stuff that I've talked up till now has been kind of just like your top level thesis questions for like what are the crux kind of problems that Moten brings up in the resolution, and that kind of operate as similar like critiques of the way in which the resolution becomes forwarded into like different ways of like affirming the types of governance that Moten is talking about at both the domestic and international level. And so I definitely think that the intro to Moten and IPP video can be helpful, giving you a much broader frame of some like the like more specific arguments that I'll be using to kind of like contextualize a lot of stuff that I'm talking about throughout this video, as we go and kind of talk about like how do we kind of use the stuff in the last two videos to inform the link debate, permutation debating, impact comparison debating, and alternative debating, all of which I think are really important for overall just like negative strategy and having like a strong continuation, even if it's like changing between each app to make it more specific, just like a frame that you and a skeleton that you can kind of use for what your criticism should be trying to accomplish in those neg debates, to give you a lot more direction if this is a strategy that you would want to read on the negative more often. I think to start this conversation in this video, I really want to start with the link debate, because I think that this is the place where people find like usually the most trouble with Moten and policy affirmatives, because a lot of the language that Moten is using is like pretty like generic in terms of like the way it's like framing overall structural critiques of like the world in general, and not really identifying many institutions beyond the academy and like various types of like policy institutions generally that really fit the category of like what he is critiquing. And so I definitely think that it takes like a broadening your research base from just Moten and Harney, and think about the way in which Moten and Harney can speak through other authors as kind of like a frame for like the way in which you contextualize some of your more specific link arguments. I think that all of the kind of like critiques of global modeling and critiques of just like global organizations such as the WTO that are about capitalism and about colonial extraction are extremely good link arguments to read within Moten and Harney stuff, because I think that you then have both your top level kind of like thesis criticism of the way in which the field of intellectual property rights is something that the 1AC has already like produced violence within, but also how the explicit action that the 1AC is taking within that field is also like particular part of like the question of colonial extraction, the ability for the WTO to like produce further forms of like privatization. I think there are a lot of good arguments to be made about like why the idea of like abolishing intellectual property protections in the status quo without a really structural shift from capitalism produces kind of like the same impacts on relationships to patent law just like produced in like privatized corporations, which makes it even worse because like there are like explicit ways in which those corporations can block out and segregate like access to like particular key resources that are necessary in certain places, which can be authorized by like the WTO as an international body, especially when it like comes to questions of like which countries are members and which countries have like stronger say in international organizations such as this. And so I think that either way that affirmatives go, whether or not they're trying to like sustain the question of intellectual property protections in the name of like economic salvation, I think there are obviously ways that you can critique like economic, like capitalist economic logics in the way that like maintaining intellectual property protections basically dooms like people's ability to like reliably access medical alternatives, which is like important in a world that's like approaching like, for instance, like questions of like abortion rights in places like Texas, etc., or even just like internationally where things like COVID vaccines are not like equally dispersed, etc. I think there are so many arguments to be made about like why both the like maintenance of that field produces a particular form of violence against marginalized groups, but also why the abolition of such a field would still like create like a kind of like a form of violence that isn't prevented or resolvable by the alternative and makes the status quo worse because of the risk of privatization. And so I think that a good criticism in this kind of sense definitely does the work of being able to access affirmatives that are both kind of in the direction of like trying to like maintain things similar to the status quo in terms of like the international order and like economic prosperity, but also how you're able to touch like impacts or teams that are trying to move to the soft left field in order to get to the question of how do we get rid of intellectual property protections, or how does this field look like something that like marginalized groups can access more easily and can access more reliably. I think that then when you kind of like shift a lot of this advice to like what the permutation may look like, a lot of your answers and responses to the permutation I think come from that framing argument that we were talking about in the last video about the difference between policy and planning. A lot of the link contextualization explanation that I just gave for this section of the video did a lot of the work of showing you like what are the ways in which you can win the mutual exclusivity between the alternative that we'll eventually get to talk about and the question of the affirmative. And if those things are mutually exclusive, then how does the 1AC not produce a subsumption, a way of subsuming planning through the act of policy and other forces of violence? And I think that there are a lot of ways in which you can then kind of like make arguments that not only at a theoretical basis but also at example basis of how international organizations such as the WTO authorize and standardize like westernized notions that block out like medicine alternatives, and show why the 1AC only looks like the ability to privatize and commercialize such uses instead of actually like looking for a model for what could look like mutual aid as something international. And that I feel like gives you so much more ground to stand on the alternative and the impact comparison that you really want to go for, because when you go to the impact comparison force of the debate, I think a lot of the arguments you really need to make here are about the way in which the kind of like the argument that Moten says, which is like the socioecological crisis, i.e. the way in which we are kind of like moving towards questions of like climate change and ways of like our entire like world being consumed by various forces of colonialism that like pollute both our like social like relationships but also our like physical bodies, and the way in which that is like produced by the way in which we block out alternatives to the way in which we orient our subjects and ourselves in the status quo. And I think that being able to make arguments about why that kind of like not only allows you to weigh like a larger scale impact in terms of like ecological crises, but also like the way in which you can weigh how our commitment to the current order that we're living now, or the current way in which the world exists now, necessitates us to move towards forces of violence, necessitates us to live in a world that is necessarily unethical and creates and like authorizes the killing of various marginalized groups because of the way in which we become like invested in the very same system of like knowledge standardization and like intellectual property protections that the 1AC is kind of investing in. And so then when you get to the alternative, you have a really good set of like examples to already speak from, where people are trying to access a different way of coming together internationally, to access questions of mutual aid, to access questions of medical resource, and resistance to the way in which policy subsumes and tries to like authorize or block out the ability for these like radical alternatives to be like achieved in ways that actually like help people at a larger scale. And I think that under cosmopolitanism as a method can be really interesting because of the way in which it takes a take on it basically takes a twist on the connectivity question of cosmopolitanism and makes it not a question of like how we can like restore that through representative democracy, but actually how we restore it through like a question of connecting mutual struggles and mutual commitment against forces of coloniality that enforce the kind of like forms of violence that induce like the everyday forms of socioecological crisis that kind of like set the background for a lot of this criticism. Hopefully this video was helpful for you, and hopefully you'll tune into the next video that I'll be doing talking about Moten intellectual property protections, because I'm really enjoying doing this series, and I really hope that you take it into just your ideas for what you're thinking about preparing for and reading for this resolution, because I think it could be really good. Yeah, thanks.